see that I haven't been idle. And then after I finished the last one, and they're all described, I've got a short summary on an attachment page that was passed out. And there's information at the bottom there on the last one. After I finished the last one, I thought to myself, why have I had to do this to begin with? One of the interesting things that Michael Graham mentioned in his little talk earlier was that whatever happens in Massachusetts spreads elsewhere. Well, the one good thing that happened in Massachusetts didn't go anywhere. It was killed later on by people appointed by Governor Patrick and later on by our current governor and Secretary of Education. So we don't have the good standards tests and teacher licensing regulations and tests that we once had when I was in the department. And I'll just review briefly who I am for those of you who may not know who I am. I was, from 99 to 2003, Senior Associate Commissioner in the Department of Education. And what is happening in K-12 is going to everywhere in this country, because I'm aware of what's going on in all of the states. I've been testifying all over the country. But what's happening in K-12 is going to make sure that groups like this don't have any meetings anymore. The kids who are going to be coming out will know even less than they know now, which is pretty low. They certainly don't know much about the Constitution. And what's happening in higher ed is another sad story, which I won't even go into, because it piggybacks off of the absence of whatever teaching used to take place in K-12 and doesn't anymore. In any event, I wanted you to see these 4 books because they all go together. After I left the department and thought I would be retiring after I went down to Arkansas for 5 years at the university there. First of all, I was talking in this first book about how to construct a good English reading curriculum. Then I went into our licensure tests for teachers and regulations for teachers and administrators, and that was what an empty curriculum was about, so that people would know what I was doing. I was working 7 days a week, 24 hours a day while I was in the department because I was in charge of almost everything that was academic. Then I wrote the book on low achievers because, as you probably know, the focus of all federal money in education is going to, quotes, close gaps, and it's directed to the lowest achievers. Well, if any of you have been in the schools or taught or had kids in the schools, you will know that the good teachers do not teach to the bottom, they teach to the top, and they help to pull up the bottom. If you teach to the bottom, you pull down the top, and that's what's been going on since 2010 with the adoption of Common Core. Then in my last book, because I was asked by the vice president of Rowman and Littlefield, would I focus on the roots of low achievement, I really wanted to hit home the fact that all the federal money that has been going to help low achievers or to try to help low income or poor low achieving kids since 1965, LBJ's War on Poverty, almost all of that money has been worse than just throwing it out of a window. We would have been better off throwing all of those billions, maybe even $1 trillion, out of the window, because we've got nothing that's changed anything. The groups that were at the bottom in 1965 are still at the bottom on every academic index that one can mention. Now, there were some interesting things that were happening around 1965. Those of you who are as old as I am may remember. 1965 was the first authorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It was the first time the USED, the federal government, really put a lot of money and focused on K-12. It's not in the Constitution. It's not supposed to be doing anything, the federal government, with regard to education policies. But in 1965, Daniel Patrick Moynihan came out with his famous report and was almost tarred and feathered out of Washington, D.C. for the things he said about his report, his findings. That was the political context for LBJ's ESSA. It came out a month later. The idea, the intentions were good. They wanted to help low-achieving blacks, and this was about 10 years after the Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act. So they were trying to help poor kids who had been in segregated schools, and these were now declared illegal, which they were. In 1966, Congress also authorized another major report called the Coleman Report. Both Coleman and Moynihan were sociologists. They were brilliant men who wrote well. They had both come to the same conclusion, and that is the amazing thing to me when I began reading these reports again. Their conclusion was that home background, family background, was more important than anything that happened in the schools. Well, guess where Congress has been putting all of its eggs in the past 50 years? In the schools. You had two reports that were widely acclaimed, still respected, especially Coleman's. They were the most comprehensive reports, yet Congress and all of these state leaders everywhere simply ignored their basic finding, which was that home background, family background, was more important in determining achievement, academic achievement, than teachers or schools. But we have had, since 2010, and the adoption of Common Core, which I'm not going to talk about here, because I've written about it everywhere and testified in most of the states in this country about it, along with a mathematician at Stanford named Jim Milgram. But we have had people ignoring those reports and that conclusion and trying to figure out what kinds of interventions, programs in education would help raise low-income or low-achieving kids. And we've had almost complete failure. But after 50 years, does anyone care? They still throw money out the window. Nobody cares. Even in Massachusetts, we had the highest scores because I was in the department at the time. We created something that didn't set a model for the rest of the country, even though it should have. Because after the standards and tests that I helped to create, I didn't do them all by myself, we had staff there to do it, but after these standards and tests were implemented, kids in Massachusetts hit the first place on our national tests, state tests. They were doing fine on our national test, NAEP, as it's called, National Assessment of Education Progress. And they hit first place in grade 8 science, tied with Singapore for grade 8 in science. What more could you ask? Yet we have criticisms today of what we did. That it's not you, it's not me.
No, it's all set.
Right. We have criticisms that we didn't do enough. Well, I don't know where you go from first place. I mean, what more can you do? If you're in first place, there's not much more that you can do. And that's where we ended up. At 2010, when under Governor Patrick, because Romney had left office before then, and now Maura Banta was chair of the board, Patrick appointed her, and under Governor Patrick, the state dumped the standards that we had in math and English and reading and adopted standards that would close gaps. No one to this day has explained how you close a gap, an academic gap. You know, if you have a pothole in the street, you put in something to close a gap. How do you close a gap academically? You can't pour knowledge into kids' heads. There's no way you can close a gap. What it meant really was lowering the ceiling. That's the only way it turned out you could close a gap. Well, what's been happening since 2010, because we had two very rich but educationally ignorant people, Bill and Melinda Gates, who had 64 billion, 96 billion. We've lost track of how to even count their billions. They decided they knew what was good for other people's children. Their children went to a private, academically oriented private school in Seattle. All the other kids would have the standards and be subjected to a vast experiment in closing gaps.
Sandra?
And nobody complained. One more minute left. Okay. So I've been trying to figure out why did no one care about what happened in Massachusetts, particularly our current governor, who was on the state board at the time these standards were being approved, and our current Secretary of Education, Jim Pizer, who, along with David Driscoll, at that time Commissioner of Ed, hired me. So they can't claim ignorance. They knew exactly what was being lost and what was happening. What was happening is that minorities everywhere were doing worse. The gaps were widening according to the way they measured gaps. And so we now have a dysfunctional school system. All I'm trying to do everywhere I go and talk is to say that we need a stronger K-12 curriculum and stronger teachers. Because when we had our own standards that our own teachers had made, everybody was doing better. But apparently that is not what current educators want. They're trying to centralize education in Washington, D.C., USED. For what purpose? Not to help minorities, but to control the votes. As part of what Graham was talking about, and he was right on target, once you have education totally under the control, including the curriculum, what kids actually read and study in school, once that is totally controlled, then you don't get any independent thinking at all. People in our State Department of Ed know what's going on. Certainly Baker and Pizer know what's going on. But why they don't want to learn from the past in this state, I don't understand. They won't even talk to me. After Pizer was appointed Secretary of Education, I wrote him a note, congratulations. Never even said thank you to me. And he knew me. He knew me well because he had been voting to accept everything that I had been doing when I was working in the department. But now they don't acknowledge whatever took place. In fact, they're doing their best to try to make it look like we need to spend a lot more money on poor kids, low-achieving kids, which is why I wrote The Roots of Low Achievement, to point out that we know the answers from research. We don't even do any more research. The research was done in '65. That's 50 years ago.
All right.
The whole thing is a joke. It's a sad joke on the taxpayers of the state. I'll stop.
Questions for Sandra? Chuck?
Yesterday I spoke to a loony lefty in Lexington who extolled the virtues of education in Europe, particularly France. And he was insistent that that there are no private schools in, I think he said France, and that rich people are required to send their children to the public schools. What should I have said to him?
Well, first of all, that person needs to look up the facts. I mean, when people talk, if they don't have facts at their disposal, then you've lost the argument to begin with before you've gone into any detail.
See, I didn't have the facts either.
I mean, everybody sends kids to public schools, including in France, the refugees that have become, from Arab countries, those that went to France and however they got in, migrant workers' children. And they are not doing better in France. At one point, there was an effort made to claim that they were doing as well as the ordinary French kid was doing. But France no longer can make that claim. They're as bad in math as every other European country is.
Okay, Roger.
Welcome back, Sandy. It's good to see you again. How would you rate, and choose whatever scale you wish, our current Secretary of Education, Ms. DeVos?
How would I rate
How would you
our
rate-
current
National.
Secretary of Ed?
Yeah.
National.
At the federal level.
Oh, at the federal level? I would not have chosen someone who doesn't know very much about education. And the problem is that most of the people in the department, either who stayed there or were then appointed later, were from the Common Core School of Thinking. And she may come up with a good idea, but it's been filtered through all the other people below her. So she doesn't know enough about education. She had been chairman, I believe, in Michigan of the Republican Party and spent a lot of the family money. This was Amway money in Detroit, which is still a basket case. I mean, we still don't have better results. If you look at NAEP tests, they tell you that those are sample tests that have not yet been manipulated. They're going to be manipulated because there's a board appointed by Congress and with the help of the Department of Education, USED, and they're going to make sure that they're going to change performance levels. They put out RFPs for it. So there will be changes that will make it look as if kids are doing better in this country, when everyone you talk to knows that they're doing worse. I mean, it's like people don't want to believe reality. Everything is the opposite of what is being claimed, and no one
Okay,
is
Sandra,
telling.
we have to move on.
Okay.
Thank you.
You walk over there.
All right, how about